I've got to tell you that I am so honored to get to introduce my friend, Mr. Fred Gray. We've had speakers in the library for 11 plus years, 12 years, 13 years. Thank you, Charles. We've had Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia. We've had theologians near and far. We've had a host of incredible people. And I've, by the grace of God in my life, had a chance to meet wonderful people. Most anybody you meet is wonderful if you get to know them. But I've gotten to meet people who most would be excited to meet, whether it's Joe Biden or whether it's George Bush, whether it's entertainers, athletes. But I'm not speaking lightly when I say Fred Gray surpasses them all in my book of who I care to meet in my life. This gentleman is history. And he's history in our country, helping to shepherd and guide America into a better America. We've got dear friends from Israel here tonight, Lika and Emmanuel Tove. Welcome. Lika, by the way, a wonderful artist whose art exhibition is opening in the library tonight, and you will want to see some of her art. Becky and I have some. It's wonderful. We've got friends from Germany who are here. Here we go. The German quartet who found out about Mr. Gray speaking and said, we want to be there. If you want to know how incredible Fred Gray is, you can read about him. I've got his biography, and we'll have copies for sale, and he'll sign some. Bus Ride to Justice. You can know how incredible he is by reading this book. You can know how incredible he is by listening tonight, by listening tomorrow, by visiting with his son, Fred Jr., who is his law partner, a wonderful lawyer, a brilliant young man. And I say young because I'm like a year older than he is. Dawn Cherie, his daughter, granddaughter, is out here for this. And I can't think of a better way to spend Martin Luther King weekend than having a weekend with Fred Gray. And so before... Stand up. Fred is going to give some opening remarks. And then I'm going to question him. I get to question the lawyer. And you do too. You should have an ability. Do we have cards that we've got out tonight? Below your seat or in front of you are cards. If you want to write out a question, I'll try and ask that question of Mr. Gray. If you get the Montgomery, Alabama newspaper, the headline front page story on Wednesday of this week was all of the Martin Luther King celebrations, so people would know. There's this huge picture above the fold of Martin Luther King being kissed by Coretta Scott King. And in the picture on the paper right behind him is Fred Gray. And I'm proud of him because if it had been me, I'd have been doing this. But he was just being the lawyer he was, a consummate professional and man of God. So one more time, join me in welcoming Fred Gray.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much, Attorney Mark Lanier. I just want to say, it's nice to have introductions like that, but they tell me they are good to rub on, but not to take in. But thank you very much, brother, very much. And I want to thank you for inviting me here and being responsible for what is taking place here this weekend in Houston. I also want to thank Dr. Randy Lowry, the immediate past president of Lipscomb University and president emeritus of that university. He is responsible really for all of this because when he was the president over 10 years ago, he saw something that he wanted to help do. And he knew about my record. I'd met him when he was at Pepperdine. And when he got to Lipscomb's, he ended up being sure that I received an honorary doctor's degree. And then later they named the Lipscomb Institute of Law, Justice, and Society the Fred Gray Institute, and entered into a memorandum of understanding with that university and me, in which there were 5 points that we were working on. And one of those things, and I didn't realize it, even meant what he's doing now in helping us to support the Tuskegee Human and Civil Rights Multicultural Center located in Tuskegee, Alabama. Give those 2 men a applaud. And Dr. Lowry now is driving. He brought us up here yesterday, and he's now driving back from Dallas, and we'll get here sometime before we finish. Give them a hand. My wife usually travels with me on these events, but she's ill and was unable to come, but she sends her regrets. It's good to have my son, Fred Jr., who's also a law partner of mine, and his daughter, Dawn Cherie, who's with us. Now, on Monday, January the 15th, 2024, we celebrate Dr. Martin Luther King's birthday as a legal holiday across this country. It has a special meaning to me for many reasons, all of which I can't tell you tonight because they haven't given me that much time. But I will share with you a few things, some similarities and some differences in the role that we played, so that what you know about him and what you may learn about Fred Gray, you'll be able to understand. First of all, I was one of the 2 persons in Montgomery, Alabama, who immediately after Mrs. Parks was arrested on December 1st, and after we had had a conference earlier that day and she knew I was going to be out of town, and when I got back, I had a phone call that she had been arrested. She wanted me to come to her house and talk with her. This was on a Thursday. and she will have to be in court on the following Monday. I went to her house, talked with her. She retained me. And I reminded Mrs. Parks that there was a lady in Montgomery, Joanne Robinson, who was a professor of English at Alabama State University, which was my undergraduate school, who had had a problem on the buses back in 1948. And she had always been wanting to get the people in Montgomery involved, the black people in Montgomery involved in doing away with the problems we were having on the bus. After Miss Parks retained me, and I said, you know, Miss Parks, you've done your part. When we talked earlier, I didn't know what you were going to do, and I'm not sure you knew what you were going to do, but we had talked about if the opportunity presented it, she knew what to do, and she did exactly what we had talked about. But I say, Mr. E.D. Nixon, who was Mr. Civil Rights in Montgomery, had gotten her out of jail because they knew I was not there. And I said, I'm going to go and talk to Mr. Nixon. I talked to Mr. Nixon. I told him about Joanne Robinson. And he said, and he was a Pullman car porter. And the next day, he was going to have to get on the train, go to Chicago, and come back in 3 days. So he said, you go on and talk to Miss Robinson, Professor Robinson. I talked with her. And on the evening of December 1st, and the morning of December 2nd, 1955, in Joanne Robinson's living room, we prepared the plans for what developed into the Montgomery bus boycott. We didn't call it a boycott, we called it a protest. Joanne says, well, I was concerned about filing a lawsuit, but it takes a long time for lawsuits to go through. She said, I'm concerned about people staying off of the buses so that these folks will know how bad African Americans have been treated. And these are the plans and the conclusions that we reached. Number one, rather than think about the time it go in the courts, she said, well, let's have and tell the people to stay off of the buses just one day, the day of Mrs. Parks' arrest, and then after that, we'll see where we go. I said, well, that's fine. But if we are successful, how are we going to keep them off of the buses until I can file a lawsuit and be able to go back on the buses on a non-segregated basis? She said, well, we need to make some more plans. She said, number one, there are a couple of things you need to think about. One, you need the two black leaders here needs to be involved. E.D. Nixon, I've talked with you about. The other one was Rufus Lewis. Rufus Lewis is a former coach at Alabama State, had a nightclub, and the name of that nightclub was the Citizens Club. And guess what? In order to get in it, you had to be a registered voter. But what does that have to do with people being arrested? His wife, Jewel, was co-owner of the largest black funeral home in Montgomery, the largest then, Ross and Clayton, and the largest now, still is all these years later. They have cars, they have drivers, they don't use them except for funerals. If we get him to be chairman of the transportation committee, he'll get his wife and all these people to be involved. Then we say, if you're going to get the message out to these people to stay off of the buses on Monday, the black preachers are the ones who have more people than we had, more black folks going to church then than we have now. And we need to get them involved. And I said, fine. And they said, then if we're going to stay off more than a day, we got to have somebody to speak for the people. We need a spokesman. And there needs to be somebody who really can speak. Joanne Robinson says, I'll tell you who that is. My pastor, Martin Luther King Jr. Haven't been here long, but one thing he can do, he can move people with words. And I said, well, one other thing you're going to need too, you're going to need a lawyer. Here am I, send me. The plans we made were Dr. King would be the spokesman. And when we had the meeting later on after her trial, he was selected to be the spokesman and president of the new organization that we formed, the Montgomery Improvement Association, at a meeting before he got there. Secondly, they ended up selecting Mr. E.D. Nixon to be the treasurer because he was a member, his president of the Pullman unit was going to be there. So they ended up selecting him to be the treasurer. And then they selected Mr. Lewis to be chairman of transportation. And we said, here am I, send me. We made all those plans in her living room. We didn't want people to know who we were. We conveyed that information to Mr. Nixon. Mr. Nixon contacted the black president of the Ministerial Association. They made the plans and had the first meeting in that Friday evening when Mr. Nixon had gone on the train up to Chicago. They approved it. Ms. Parks was arrested. The trial took us about 20 minutes. We got her out on bond. They formed what became known as the bus boycott, and they had the first meeting at the Holt Street Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama on the evening. And Joanne Robinson and I, as we sat and listened to Dr. King talk on that evening, we said to each other, you know, I think we did the right thing. And the rest of that is history. Now you know how about the beginning of the Montgomery bus boycott. But how did I get involved in it before that time? So let me just tell you 2 or 3 other things, and then I'm going to have to stop so that the lawyer over here will be able to ask me any questions on anything I've missed. But what we ended up, after going to, in the temple, when I came up, I was born on December 14th, 1930, in Montgomery, in the cradle of the Confederacy. My father died when I was 2. I was the youngest of 5 children. And my mother taught the 5 of us who only had about a 5th grade education and did domestic work for white ladies in their kitchen and in their homes. She said, you all can be anything you want to be if you do 3 things. 1, keep Christ first in your life. 2, stay in school and get a good education. And 3, stay out of trouble. Don't get involved in this criminal justice because justice doesn't always do. I tried to instill that into my 4 children, and I hope they have tried to instill it into their children. That was the plan. I baptized cats and dogs, and we had a preacher from Nashville, and they said, well, you need to, and at that time, only blacks could look forward to about 2 good professions, a teacher and a preacher. And if you did either one of them, you did it on a segregated basis. And since I was baptizing cats and dogs, he ended up taking us to the school up in Nashville that had a relationship with David Lipscomb College. And the president of that school was a black preacher, one of the greatest pioneer preachers in the Church of Christ. And when I got there, he said, as president of the school, his responsibilities was to raise money and recruit students. And he said, how do you take these little black preachers, go to these black churches throughout the South and Southeast? And we came on one of those trips to Houston here, many in 1944, 1945, and let us preach and raise money. And that was the way it all started. So when I finished there in 47 and enrolled in Alabama State, I knew a little something about preaching. I went to Alabama State College, then Alabama State College for Negroes, so I could learn how to be a teacher. I had to ride on the public transportation system. And in doing so, I found out all the problems that we were having on buses, and one man had been killed as a result of it. I decided that the black people in Montgomery had problems. And they told me that lawyers help people solve problems. I didn't know any lawyers, but I said, if that's the case, and as I saw what was going on as I was riding the buses, I made a commitment that I was going to be a lawyer. I was going to finish Alabama State, not tell anybody anything about my real plans, but the plan was to finish state, go to somebody's law school someplace, not apply to the University of Alabama because I knew they wouldn't accept me. Finish law school, take the Alabama bar exam, and at that time, if you finished University of Alabama law school, you didn't even have to take a bar exam. Pass the bar exam, become a lawyer in Montgomery, Alabama, and destroy everything segregated I could find. I did that as a youngster. And the best thing about it, I didn't tell it all. I told them I was going to be a lawyer, but even after I started practicing law, it was years before I felt comfortable enough to tell the old story. And if you want to know any more about it, you have to read it in Bus Ride to Justice. Now you know a little bit about how I got to be a lawyer. So then, now that you know that, and you know how I've been involved in the civil rights movement. When you get to be 93, you have to make some notes so you be sure you remember it all. But I'm going to have to hurry. So after my first case, and then I'm going to tell you 2 or 3 other things that are going to stop. One Rosa Parks case, one Dr. King's case, but in Dr. King, I didn't finish telling you the story, that there were several other similarities between Dr. King and me. And that is, Dr. King became pastor officially of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church on the first Sunday in September of 1954. On September the 7th, 1954, in Montgomery, Alabama, guess what? The Alabama Supreme Court licensed Fred Gray to become a lawyer. I became a lawyer in the same week that he became. It's the same group that ended up selecting Dr. King to be the spokesman and the president of the Montgomery Improvement Association, selected me in that same meeting to be his lawyer. And for 383 days after that, that's what I did. And then there's one other thing about that, about Dr. King, and I had to go back to mention this. And that is, when I was in the Alabama legislature from 1970 to 1974, in 1973, I introduced a bill to make the third Monday in January of each year a national holiday in the state of Alabama. But guess what? That bill never got out of committee. But I made the announcement at his church, and years later, it developed other lawyers taking a pattern after my bill across the country introduced the bill so that we'll celebrate that. Now, I told you all this, and I'm going to say this and sit down. And that is, we have now a whole generation of people who don't know the hardcore segregation issues. They are growing up, many of them, even many blacks who are benefiting from what we did, don't realize what happened. So it's very important that we have history museums, and you can't have all of them in Washington. You got to have some in communities. And when I represented the men in the infamous Tuskegee syphilis study, after getting all the money I could get for them, and after getting President Clinton, along with others, to make an apology to them, and one of them introduced the President of the United States and told him, so Mr. President, thanks for bringing us here. We appreciate it. But what we want is a museum in Tuskegee, Alabama, where people can come and see what we did, the contribution we made to our country in this health care program, even though we didn't know it. And he announced then that we had formed the Tuskegee Human and Civil Rights Multicultural Center for that purpose. For the last, and they promised me, they asked me, said, lawyer, will you do that last thing for them? They're all dead, but I promised them I'd do it. For 26 years, that's what I've done. Usually when I go and make speeches, not like this, because I've never been in an audience quite like this one before, but I've been in a lot of other audiences. They usually help us support it. So one of the things we're asking you, and one of the things that they're doing now in the committee that I appointed, and we're going to have a board meeting on next Thursday, and that is to have permanent support for that institution. Now then, we've made a lot of progress, and you can read about all these other cases that I have handled. But the struggle for equal justice continues. We still have two major problems, inequality and racism. They have not been all wiped out. And we have now a Supreme Court. While at one time you would expect them to rule in favor of minorities and women, and all of that has changed. You've had an upraising and an increase in racism. And if you think about what happened, what was it, on the 6th of January 3 years ago, the resurrection that took place there, all of that means that the struggle for equal justice continues. And I want to tell you, as you do what you're doing here, and as we continue to move in the right direction, I want to leave you with 2 or 3 things. One, if what we did during the struggle of the civil rights movement can help in ending these things, I think there are 2 or 3 things you can do. One, we need to recognize, and this is what we did, you need to recognize we still have a problem. If you don't think that we have a problem in this country, then it's unfortunate and you need help. But first you have to realize you have a problem. Then secondly, you have to come up with a plan to solve that problem, because it's not going to go away by itself. The declaration ought to come from the top that inequality and racism is wrong. The White House, the Congress, the Supreme Court, the heads of our corporation, the heads of our institutions, all of these things, the churches need to continue to play a role in it. Then you need to come up with a plan. Then you need to implement the plan. And then each one of us as individuals must decide that I'm going to help do it, and I'm is not going to be left up to me. I want to close you with what I represented John Lewis when he was beaten back in Montgomery when he was a student. And there was Lewis versus Macon County Greyhound Park, which finally resolved the city in question. And then I represented him again on Bloody Sunday after they had beaten back in 1965 and called me to come to Selma. And before the close of day, I filed a case of Jose Williams and others versus Governor Wallace, which ended up directing and ordering the state of Alabama to protect the marches as they went from Selma to Montgomery. And it resulted in the passage of the Voting Rights Bill of 65. And not only that, when he knew that he was sick, 2 weeks before, or less than 2 weeks before his death, he had his assistant to call me and get me on the phone. And he said to me, I said to him, I said, Congressman, you've done so much work, and you've done so much in this whole field of civil rights. What is it that you want me and others to continue to do? And he said to me, he said, brother, keep going, or keep pushing, keep going, and keep the record straight. So I said to those of you who are interested in solving the problems that we now have, keep pushing, keep going, set the record straight, do it in a non-violent manner, and do it until justice rolls down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to have folks collect questions, but I wrote down, I have 33 stories I'd like you to tell. My problem is I would keep you here all night long because there's too much to ask you. So I'm going to step back in time. You represented Rosa Parks.
Yes.
But she was not the first one to defy the buses. You had an earlier client, Claudette. Would you tell us about that?
Yes. Claudette Carvin she was then 15 years old. She still lives, and she lives in Texas now. Matter of fact, her son lives here, and I don't know where it is, one of the cities, and I talked with her about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and we talk to each other periodically. But she lived in a section of Montgomery, the northeastern part, called King Hill. Only about 2 or 3 short streets was in that community where African Americans lived, was surrounded by whites. So they had to use these black kids had to use the public school system, had to use the public transportation system to go from where they live downtown, get another bus, go to Booker Washington High School. And they knew that the first 10 seats they said was reserved for whites, and they couldn't sit in those seats whether whites came or not. And the question was, after those seats were filled, and if white people came on and blacks were sitting in those next 4 seats, they had to get up and give their seats. Well, March the 2nd was just after Black History Month had just been concluded. Claudette had been in a class, and one of her teachers was telling them about the constitutional rights that blacks have. And on the 2nd of March, the teachers had a meeting and they excused the students earlier. So these kids who usually taught the bus decided they would just walk on from where they were at Booker, Washington to the state capitol, where their bus came down Dexter Avenue and go down to the square, and they would usually get it on the square. They would just get it at Dexter, at the capitol. And they did. They got on. None of them were sitting in the first 10 seats. But when that bus got to the square, a lot of white people got on. Because this was not the bus they was usually on a much later bus. When all the 10 seats were taken and all the other seats between there and the seat just in front of the back door, then they asked Claudette, where Claudette was sitting, they asked Claudette to get up. And there were 2 other students and a black woman who was sitting in those 4 seats. The 3 of them got up. Claudette didn't get up. The driver told her, very politely, that he needed those seats to get up. She said, well, I'm not sitting in the white section, and I'm not going to move. He drove another block. Police came, arrested her, took her to jail. She called her parents. Her parents called the pastor of the Hutchinson Street Baptist Church, Reverend Johnson, who contacted E.G. Nixon. They went and got him out of jail and recommended this young lawyer who was just out to represent her. I went, represented her, and they charged her with being a delinquent. And she was being a delinquent in that she failed to get up her seat and she wouldn't obey the police officer. To make a long story short, I filed my little motion with Judge Hill, who was judge of the juvenile court of Montgomery County at the time. He took my motion, but I said, Judge is an honored student and was coming from school at the time. She's not a delinquent, but what they're trying to do is enforce the segregation laws, which require separation of the races. The judge listened to me, politely denied my motion, found her to be a delinquent, and demanded and awarded her to the custody of her parents as on behalf of the court. She was disappointed because she thought she had not violated the law. I was ready to file a lawsuit for her, but the black community wasn't quite ready at that time. But in any event, that gave the courage to Mrs. Robinson, to Fred Gray, to E.D. Nixon, to all 40-some thousand African Americans who decided if this black girl could do this under those circumstances, then the least thing we can do is stay off of the buses at least for one day, and that one day ended up being 382 days, 3 days.
Wow. Did Claudette Colvin's actions and that lawsuit and litigation you had, or defense of her, do you think that played any role in Rosa Parks deciding to do what she did? Did Claudette affect Rosa Parks?
No. Claudette, Mrs. Parks had been working in civil rights for a long time. And I don't think what Claudette did encouraged Mrs. Parks to do what she did. I think Mrs. Parks, as I had talked with her for almost a year, had already decided that if the opportunity, she wasn't going to make an issue, but if the opportunity presented itself, I didn't think Miss Parks would give up her seat voluntarily. And she didn't do that on the last meeting I had with her in my office earlier that day of December 1st.
So you met with Rosa Parks in your office the very day she got arrested for the bus?
Yes.
When you grew up in segregated Alabama, did you know as a child that things were not fair?
I don't think I thought too much about that before I came back to go to college. Segregation was what was going on, and I was trying to prepare myself to live as best I could in a segregated society. I was encouraged by the faculty members, particularly J.E. Pierce, a political instructor, and Thelma Glass, who was the first teacher who trying to tell those of us who were freshmen how we needed to learn how to study and be able to get out, since we were in college, to be able to get out of college and do it in a desirable way. So I think she was prepared to do it. But I do think what Claudette did, and Claudette attended some of Mrs. Parks' classes because she was youth director for the NAACP, and I think it helped.
All right. I've got people in here who have graduated from law school, people in here who are in law school, people in here who are lawyers. One of the scariest things you can do as a lawyer, it is scary to go in front of a federal judge. I would like for you to tell everybody about your experience when Martin Luther King was going to march to Selma.
Oh. Now, we are in 1965 is when the march occurred. My last experience with Dr. King before that time was when the state of Alabama decided in that while he was in Montgomery in 1958, they said he cheated on his income tax, and they decided to wait until 1960 to file that suit. And we tried that case before an all-white jury, believe it or not, at Montgomery, in the middle of the sit-ins that John Lewis and all were raising. And guess what? An all-white jury found Martin Luther King not guilty in that case. Scoot forward 4 years later, they had a group of students who in Selma was trying to get people over in Selma the right to vote. Well, I knew there was going to be a problem in Selma because during the third week in December of 1955, after the bus boycott started, I was called over to Selma to represent an airman at Craig Air Force Base had been arrested when he had an altercation at a traffic light about a traffic offense with a white person. The white person, they went on, but then had him arrested, and the NAACP had me to come over there and represent him. And I did. And I was referring to my client as Mr. Smith, or whatever his name was, and the judge says, you don't call him that here. And then it dawned on me, he was objecting to me referring to my client, as Mr. And then I told him, I said, well, Judge, He's a sergeant in the United States Air Force. Can I call him Sergeant so-and-so? But it was all right to call him Sergeant, but not Mr. I ended up finally leaving and getting back to it. But the last of all of it was that I knew we was going to have problems. And when they finally came back, and when they were arrested on Bloody Sunday, I ended up going over to Selma at their request and ended up representing them. They asked me, could I help them? I told them I could. And before the close of day, they ended up doing what needed to be done in order to take place. So that had all taken place. And the rest is history. But what happened after I filed the lawsuit on the next Monday?
I'm going to interrupt you. I apologize. I was not born yet. I didn't get born until 1960. So I guess I was born, but I didn't know about this. I've seen videos of the state troopers putting the dogs on people and beating people. Had that already happened before the march?
Well, that's what happened on Bloody Sunday.
Okay.
And that's what motivated them to contact me. And that's why I went Sunday night, talked to them. They said, we want to march, but we don't want to be beaten. I filed the suit that next day on Monday. On Tuesday morning early, I get a call from the law clerk of Judge Johnson, the federal district judge for the Middle District of Alabama, the only one at that time, saying that the judge wanted to have a conference with me in his office on the case I had filed the day before. And when a judge said that, the lawyer's in trouble. I went to his office, and he says, Mr. Gray, you filed a lawsuit in this court on yesterday, and you've alleged that your client's constitutional rights were violated. If their rights were violated, and the court so find, we'll grant you the relief. If the courts find they have not, you won't. He says you have filed in this court a motion for a temporary restraining order, a motion for a preliminary injunction, and a motion for a permanent injunction. He says, I'm going to deny your motion for a temporary restraining order because that would have meant enjoining the state without a hearing. He said, I'm going to set your hearing for a preliminary injunction down for a hearing on Thursday. This is 2 days away. And I understand, notwithstanding the fact that you have filed an action invoking the jurisdiction of this court, that your clients are now saying they're going to march to Montgomery anyhow. And the court has entered an injunction enjoining them from doing it. I tried to tell Judge Johnson that he don't understand the people in the movement, and he knew then while Dr. King was there on Bloody Sunday, he was there on Tuesday and was there on that Monday. He says, you're an officer of the court, control your clients. I left. I went to Selma. I found, and I didn't want to talk to anybody but Dr. King. I didn't call him Dr. King. You see, this is now 1965, and we've been together since 55. And I said, Martin, what we've been working on ever since we started in Montgomery, this is the greatest opportunity we have to really get people registered to vote that could make a difference. And I think we have a judge who will do it, but I need to use these next 2 days and get this case ready for trial. I gave him a copy of the court's order. I said the marshal will be over here later on and serve it on you. I just want from you your commitment that you will not lead those people across the bridge. I don't want to know how you're going to do it. And he was saying, well, you know, I got all these people here. We shook hands and he says, Fred, I'm going to obey the order and I'm not going to do it. So when you saw the movie and saw the state troopers come up at the second march, and then saw Dr. King and the others come on the other side, and you saw the state troopers turn and went back, and you saw Dr. King and his group had a prayer and went back. They went back to a church. I don't know where the officers went. I guess they went back to their posts. But both groups realized that we had filed the lawsuit. They knew there was a hearing on Thursday, and they knew whatever happened on that bridge that day would be testified to and shown to the court on Thursday. So both of them decided they would abide by the court's order, and the rest of it is history.
You go into the hearing and you have the trial, and the judge rules in your favor. But the state had the right to appeal.
Yes.
How did that process out?
Oh, this is what happened. We tried the case. It took us 3 or 4 days to try it. And I told you earlier when I just filed the lawsuit, he just called me that next day on Tuesday. But this time, after he ruled one day, the next morning early, he called all the lawyers involved in the lawsuit. And he had already designated the federal government as a party plaintiff. And John Doe with the Justice Department was there representing the government on our side. And he says, you've all gotten a copy of the court's order. And I hear that you have not appealed it. The state of Alabama hadn't appealed it, but I understand you plan to appeal. He says, if you're going to appeal it, you need to appeal it immediately because I have set a special Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit in New Orleans at 6 o'clock this evening. And there is a plane leaving Montgomery going to New Orleans that will get you there in time for that hearing. One of the lawyers for the state says, Judge, did you make reservations for us to go down? He was representing the state. The judge said, no, I didn't make reservations, Mr. So-and-so, but I know they have space for you. Well, the state lawyers didn't have to worry about it anyway because they went and got a state plane and went down. But John Doe, representing the government, and Fred Gray couldn't do that. John Doe decided that the government would end up leasing a plane to take him down for the hearing. And since I represented the plaintiffs in the case, he invited me to go with him. So I get on this plane with John Doe. We have time on that plane going down to New Orleans to get ready for our hearing at 6 o'clock. We had the hearing. The court immediately decided the case and ruled in favor of Judge Johnson. Very seldom you've ever had a case that went as fast as that case went. When we got ready to go back, a cold front had come in. The plane that John Doe had leased didn't have de-icing equipment on it. So you got all these people at Maxwell Air Force Base in Montgomery getting ready for the march, and it had to take place in a certain time. What did Mr. Doe do? He contacted somebody at Maxwell Air Force Base. They sent a government plane down to pick up John Doe, and guess what? Fred Gray went along with him. And they ended up at the airport, and when we got to the airport, there was a black airman to pick me up and to take me home. And of course, John Doe had his people to take him. And when I looked at the man, I recognized him. He was Mr. Thomas. Mr. Thomas was the husband of one of my secretaries, and he is the one who took me home from that event. And the rest of it is history.
That's fantastic. So I want to get on any audience questions. If y'all want to pass them to the center aisle, we'll figure out who can grab those, and we'll have a chance to ask some of those. But I'm curious about something that you've told me about, and I'd like other people to hear it. Governor Wallace was a racist governor. He was someone you had to sue. You'd actually had cases in front of him before he became governor when he was a judge. But at the end of his life, you found him a changed man. Would you tell us about, all of us want to know how God can change things. Tell us about the changes in Governor Wallace.
I first met Governor Wallace in the late 50s. He was then a circuit judge in Barber and Bullock County, which is south of Macon County. And I later became the first African American, along with one of others, to serve representing him. But I met him first when a black young man had been arrested. He didn't know it by, he was going to his father's pasture. When he got that done, he passed a car going up the road. He was going down the road, and a white man came down when he was going over in the pasture. He had another boy, and the man had a pistol and said, "Why don't you slow down that car?" He said, "Well, I was going less than the speed limit." The white man didn't tell him who he was. The boys simply finished what they was doing, closed the gate, and left the white man there with the pistol on him. Guess who the white man was? He was a district attorney for that district. He found out who they were, had them arrested, and I was called in to defend him. And it was before George Wallace. We finally ended up resolving that case. But that was my introduction to him. And E.D. Nixon, the same one I've talked about, was able to help to resolve that issue too. But years later, after school desegregation was about to take place, there was a group of black people in Barber County in Eufaula, Alabama, and there was about 2 streets that black people lived on around, and there was a white community. They decided they was going to build a school on one side of town for whites and a school on the other town where black people lived, and that would prevent segregation. So we saw they came to me, well, they started condemning the property. And when they condemned the property, they went to George Wallace's court. In the meantime, I filed a federal suit to try to stop them from condemning the property. In the meantime, the commissioners in the probate court gave to my black clients very good awards. But I wanted to file the suit. I filed the suit. And when they got these, then they appealed the award. And my agreement with them was I would get a percentage of the amount above what the commissioners had given. So if I didn't get anything, then they wouldn't get anything. We tried them before a jury, before George Wallace, and I had raised the fact that blacks were systematically excluded from juries and all those jurors on those cases were white, and they gave them real nice verdicts, nice awards. And I still wanted to continue my appeal. They sent a delegation up to Tuskegee and said, Lawyer, we appreciate what you've done. We've gotten enough money out of these cases now where we can build us a house over on the bluff where they're building the black school. You can get a decent fee because you've gotten an amount substantially above what we had, and we can dismiss the lawsuit. And we have decided not to appeal. We didn't. Move forward, a few years later, the same George Wallace decides to run for governor. And he decides that he was going to run. And John Patterson also decided to run. John Patterson was the Attorney General for the state of Alabama. And in Tuskegee, when they changed the city limits and excluded all the blacks and left all the whites in, except barely didn't include any whites, then they ended up, to keep them from having a right to vote in Macon County, it gave rise to Gormillion v. Lightfoot, the first case. But what Patterson did was file a suit to try to make the black people in Macon County trade with the merchants, the white merchants downtown, paddling after what black people had done in Montgomery, staying off of the buses. And the local county judge in Macon County, Willow Walton, listened to it and ultimately ruled in favor of blacks, saying that they had a right to trade with whoever they wanted and they hadn't proved the case. John Patterson, we put on the stand, and I asked him whether what he was really doing, he wasn't concerned about those white people there. He was concerned about getting to be governor. He did not deny that he was going to run for governor, but he says, if I decide to run, I don't intend to declare my intentions on this witness stand. And he didn't. He won. George Wallace lost. It's reported that he said later he wasn't going to let anybody outseg him. Then the next time he ran, he won as a segregationist. When he decided to run for president, he was shot. And he later decided that what he was doing was wrong. He ran his wife for governor, and she won. He later was reelected, and we supported him, and the rest of that is history. And he's one of the ones who I said assisted me in my legal career.
He actually, wow. All right. We have a bunch of questions, and they're as good as any set of questions I've ever been given in this room to ask. Some of them are quick. We don't have a lot of time. I'll get through as many as we can. How old were you when you represented Rosa Parks? How old were you when you represented Rosa Parks?
I was 24. She was on December the 1st, and I would have become 25 on the 14th of December, and she was arrested December 1st.
What were your ways of, how did you study in law school? How did you learn all of that?
How did I do what?
How did you study in law school?
Oh, when I got to law school, I had found out I need the courses. And in law school at Case Western in Cleveland, where I was, they told you what on each course, usually what the majority opinion, well, they told you first what Ohio ruled. Then they tell you what the majority opinion was. Then they tell you the jurisdictions that had the minority opinions. And I decided in each one of my classes, so I would be prepared to take the Alabama bar, on every course I attended, I found out what Alabama rule was on every rule of law. So when I came back to take the bar exam, I would be prepared just in case I wasn't able to attend a law review course that George Walter B. Jones had in Montgomery, Alabama, and it worked out all right.
How do you stay close to God? How do you stay close to God?
Well, actually, the only reason I got involved in all of this started because of my Christian beliefs. And when I looked at the situation on the Montgomery bus boycott, I concluded, as I understood Jesus' sermon on the mountain, telling us to do unto others as you would have them do unto you, that Jesus would want me to be a lawyer and help solve this problem. So every case that will come along, the first thing I have to decide, what would the Lord want me to do in this situation? If I think that's what he would want me to do, then I'll pass that bridge. The next thing I have to decide, Fred Gray has some standards himself. What do I think about it? Then I'll consider that. If I get to the next one, then the likelihood of success, I look at the issues and I try my best to think I could help people. And on those cases that I thought were very, very difficult, I try to get others to help. And that's what I did. When I was retained to represent the people in Montgomery, I contacted Thurgood Marshall. He invited me to New York to his office. They agreed to help me with it. And that was on the third week in December 1955. And the NAACP and the legal defense has been working with me on all my cases ever since.
Do you have anything that you did not put in the book that you wish you had put in the book?
What does that know?
Is there anything that you wish you'd written up in the book that you just didn't? Anything extra not in the book?
I'm not sure I'm following your question.
The sound in here is bad. You wrote this.
Yes, bus ride to justice.
It's got over 400 pages.
Yes.
Did you leave anything out?
I'm sure I did. There were many things that I did that are not written in this book. It's like I think John said, that many other things did Jesus in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these that are written, that you might believe, and that believing on them, you may have life through his name. There's a lot of things that are not in there.
You got Bishop,
If you do what's in there and follow them, it will instruct you to do what I have suggested. That is, work towards solving all these problems we have now.
You got Bishop James Dixon standing up, clapping on that one. One of these questions is, where do you see racial injustice today? I'm going to change it. Tell them about your latest lawsuit. Tell them about the case of the square in Tuskegee.
The last lawsuit we filed is we represent Macon County, and I've represented the county for a long time. And in 1906, the county owned its courthouse, and its courthouse was on about a 3 or 4 acre piece of property in the heart of Tuskegee. And that they decided to move the courthouse from that piece of property. They bought a piece of property on the north side of the courthouse, right across the street. And the daughters, the Tuskegee chapter of the Daughters of the Confederacy, approached Macon County Commission and asked the commission to convey that property where the courthouse was to the Tuskegee chapter of the Macon County Daughters of the Confederacy, so that they could use it to build a park for white people and to have a monument in that park for white people in behalf of those soldiers from Macon County who fought with the Confederacy in the Civil War. And of course, they were all white. They apparently felt that there might be a question about whether what they were doing was right, because they had a reverter provision put in the deed. If for any reason this property can't be used for that purpose, then it automatically reverted to the county. Well, that deed, they said that the deed was executed, and that was in 1906. But in 1948, somebody was checking the title and couldn't find the deed. So the then commission decided that either it was lost or something happened, but anyway, they agreed to reissue it and acknowledge the fact that those provisions were binding on them. Well, it ended up that years later, students at Tuskegee University, and they had the monument there. There was a lot of discussion over that. And finally, the county asked the county attorneys to examine title. When we examined title and found this out, we advised them that under the reverter provision in that statute, what they wanted to do could not legally be done, so the land automatically revert. We filed a lawsuit, about almost 2 years ago now. A local white judge of the Circuit Court of Macon County held that the land automatically reverted to the county, and so entered it. And then he went ahead. We didn't ask him to do this, but he was trying to be nice to the daughters and said, move your statue from it. You got 60 days to move it. We didn't ask him to move it. We told them, however, they own the land and any improvement situation they're on permanent. So it would have meant if they ruled with us, and he did. And they appealed it. The court ended up ending that order, and it's still pending in the Alabama Supreme Court.
So the Alabama...
And Fred and Stanley, my other son, really have done most of the work on that case.
So there's pending in front of the Alabama Supreme Court right now the case on whether or not you can have this all-white park in the middle of Tuskegee, Alabama, with a Confederate soldier monument in the middle. Because if it's illegal to be an all-white park with a Confederate soldier, the land goes back to the county. And the Daughters of the Confederacy are fighting that all the way to the Supreme Court.
One other thing on that point. Now, the Daughters really, and their record showed that for between 15 and 20 years, there was no Tuskegee chapter of the Daughter of the Confederacy. And it was only some years later that they ended up getting people, ladies in other areas, to end up, even though they didn't live in Macon County, to end up becoming a member of the Tuskegee chapter. But none of them, even to this day, even the president lives in a county that's almost 100 miles from Tuskegee.
In other words, to fight this case, you'd have to live in the county or have some tie to the county. And the women fighting this case as Daughters of the Confederacy live 100 miles away. They just rejoined and restarted the chapter just to try and stop this from happening. That's right now. And the Alabama Supreme Court's had this for 9 months and still hadn't ruled on it. Okay, Mr. Gray, we're out of time. And I got to get you to rest your voice because we're going to work you so hard tomorrow. I would like you to do one more thing. Did you ever feel discouraged in the struggle? And how did you keep going? Here's the question.
I have never, from the day I decided to become a lawyer until this day, been discouraged on any of these decisions that have taken place. I realized that I was doing what other lawyers had been doing and who had made a way that I thought we could move forward. So I never got discouraged about it. It's almost like the stewardship instructor at Case Ruston. I didn't take his course, but he also taught evidence, and I had to take evidence. And he used to say, every case that in stewardship, he'd say, every case that I ever lost was a moral victory. So I lost a few cases, but all of them were moral victories. But what I want to tell you as I conclude, I hope, and that is that Tuskegee is a unique place. About 4 cases that originated and filed by residents of Macon County have been precedent-setting cases that have helped people all across this nation, both black and white. And the monument and that museum that's there is you need to come and see it. It's one of the best small museums in the country. And we want you to come to visit it. And if you feel like it, help support it. Thank you.